Sophie Bennett had never been the kind of girl who drew attention. She preferred quiet corners in libraries, the company of old books, and the comfort of predictable routines. But that morning, something had forced her out of her shell and into a place that made her skin crawl with nerves. The waiting room of Hayes Women's Health Clinic was calm, almost too calm. Gentle music floated through the air, the kind made to soothe anxious minds. Soft ivory walls and expensive furniture tried their best to say, "You're safe here." But Sophie? Sophie felt anything but safe. Clutching a clipboard, her fingers trembled with every stroke of the pen. Simple questions stared back at her: name, date of birth, medical history. And yet, each box seemed harder to fill than the last. Her palms were clammy. Her heart beat loud enough that she swore the older woman sitting 2 chairs away could hear it too. She had delayed this appointment for months, told herself she didn't need it, that the discomfort would pass. But when nights got longer and symptoms louder, even she couldn't ignore them anymore. Her friend had insisted she see someone, and highly recommended a certain Dr. Daniel Hayes. At the time, Sophie imagined someone in his 60s, maybe with a graying beard and kind eyes, someone who would speak gently, get the job done, and send her on her way. She hadn't imagined the whirlwind that was about to walk through the door. "Miss Bennett?" A nurse's voice broke through the thick fog of Sophie's thoughts. Her breath hitched. "Yes," she said too quickly, her voice thin. The nurse gave a polite nod and gestured for her to follow. Down the hall, Sophie tried not to stare at the closed exam rooms they passed, or breathe too deeply through the tang of antiseptic that lingered in the air like nerves themselves. "You can wait here," the nurse said gently, leading her into a cozy office with warm lighting and polished wood. "Dr. Hayes will be with you shortly." Sophie nodded, taking a seat. Her back went ramrod straight. The exam chair loomed across the room like a quiet monster. She folded her hands, then unfolded them, tried to steady her breathing. She could do this. She just had to stay calm, be normal, say the right words. And then the door opened, and Sophie forgot how to breathe. He wasn't supposed to look like that. Dr. Daniel Hayes was young, far younger than she imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that followed him into the room like a second skin. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his eyes, blue. Deep, deep blue. He was dressed professionally, but nothing about him looked clinical. Everything about him was magnetic. "Miss Bennett," he said warmly, his voice even and reassuring. "I'm Dr. Hayes. It's nice to meet you." Sophie stared, mute, as heat flooded her cheeks. This was not going to be easy. For days after that first appointment, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about him. Not just because he was handsome, which he was, painfully so, but because of the way he looked at her. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with something she couldn't quite place. It was like he saw right through the layers of her fear and shyness and found something worth being patient for. And that scared her more than anything else. So she did what Sophie Bennett always did when things got too big, too bright, too close. She retreated. She ignored the clinic's follow-up calls, deleted the reminder emails, told herself she'd get better on her own, that it had all been a misunderstanding, that flutter in her chest was just nerves. But at night, as she lay awake under the weight of her too soft blanket, she knew the truth. She wasn't avoiding the appointment. She was avoiding him. But fate. Fate has a curious way of nudging people back to where they're meant to be. It was a rainy Thursday when Sophie found herself in her favorite little cafe, a quiet place tucked between 2 aging bookstores, the kind of spot the world forgot about. She went there when she needed peace, when her thoughts got too loud. She was sitting by the window, a steaming mug of chamomile tea cradled between her hands, her nose buried in a worn paperback romance when a familiar voice pulled her back to the present. "Didn't think I'd find you here?" She froze. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. That voice had been haunting her dreams and waking thoughts for weeks. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her gaze. Daniel Hayes stood just a few feet away, rein on his shoulders, a paper cup in hand, and that same easy smile she'd tried so hard to forget. Sophie's mouth opened, but no words came. Her heart began its familiar gallop, her cheeks already heating with embarrassment. He chuckled, clearly amused by her wide-eyed panic. "Relax," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for permission. "I won't bite." Her voice finally returned, small, tight, breathy. You come here often?" Daniel leaned back slightly, eyes twinkling. "Every morning before clinic hours. This is my quiet place." Of course it was, because the universe apparently had a sense of humor. The silence between them stretched. But unlike in his office, it didn't feel clinical or suffocating. It felt strangely comfortable, like the world outside had pressed pause. Sophie stared into her cup. "I'm sorry I missed my follow-up." Daniel tilted his head. "Are you?" She met his gaze then. Really met it. And what she saw wasn't judgment. It was curiosity, and something softer. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. "Not of you, of me." That answer seemed to knock the smile from his lips, just a little. His eyes softened. "You don't have to run from what you feel, Sophie," he said gently. "Not with me." And for the first time in a long, long while, Sophie believed someone, even if only for a moment. It started like any other evening, quiet, dim, and ordinary. Sophie had just finished her shift at the bookstore, the kind of day that left her feet aching and her heart a little heavier than usual. She curled up on the couch with her dinner, half-heartedly scrolling through her phone while a rerun played in the background. Then, it happened. She paused mid-scroll, her thumb hovering above the screen. It was his name. Dr. Daniel Hayes, the millionaire doctor behind a women's health empire. Her stomach dropped. A familiar chill slid down her spine. She tapped the article, her heartbeat drumming louder with each passing sentence. Photos, awards, accolades. He wasn't just a doctor. He was the doctor. Founder of Hayes Medical Group, owner of multiple private clinics across the state, a leader in medical innovation, a keynote speaker, a face on magazine covers, and rich. Not just upper-middle-class rich, but private jet, luxury estate, headline-making rich. Sophie's fingers tightened around the phone, her chest constricting. How had she been so naive? She had sat across from him, sipped tea in front of him, and spoken like they were anything close to equals. And all this time, he was this. He was the kind of man whose suits probably cost more than her monthly rent. The kind of man women competed for, admired, Googled. And she was Sophie Bennett, a girl with student loans, thrifted jeans, and no idea what she was doing most days. A girl who skipped meals when rent was due, who once cried in the back room because she couldn't afford new shoes when hers split open. She shut the phone off and stared at the ceiling. How foolish she'd been, to feel seen, chosen, noticed. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was real life. And in real life, girls like her didn't end up with men like him. From that night on, Sophie changed. She stopped replying to his texts. She avoided the cafe, took different routes to work, even pretended to be asleep when he called. She told herself it was for the best, that what she felt wasn't real, that she'd only been caught up in a fantasy. But every time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt. Every time she passed the clinic, her steps faltered. Every time she closed her eyes, it was his voice she heard in the quiet, and that was the cruelest part of all. Because even now, even after knowing the truth, she still missed him. Daniel Hayes had been called a lot of things in his life. Brilliant, talented, unreachable, too young to be that successful, too handsome to be taken seriously. But no one had ever ignored him, until Sophie Bennett. At first, he thought she was just busy. Life got in the way after all. He sent one message, then two, then three. All met with silence. And still, he waited. Days passed, then weeks. No sign of her at the cafe, no appointments scheduled, no laughter drifting from her favorite table in the bookstore when he passed by. It was as if she had disappeared into the cracks of the world and taken something of him with her. He told himself to let it go. He told himself she didn't owe him anything. But he couldn't forget the way her voice softened when she spoke about the books she loved. The way her fingers fidgeted with her sleeves when she was nervous. The way she looked at him. Not as a doctor, not as a millionaire, but as a man. And that was something he hadn't realized he needed until she took it away. So one evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft blue and silver, Daniel did something he rarely did. He waited. Leaning against the sleek black car parked across from the bookstore, he watched as the last flicker of light shut off behind the glass windows. The bell above the door chimed softly. There she was. Bag slung over her shoulder, a light sweater clutched in her arms, her head bent low. She didn't see him at first, not until she stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up. Her body froze. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were filled with quiet hurt. "Sophie," he said, voice low but steady. She looked like she might run. "Why are you here?" she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. Daniel stepped forward, slowly, gently, like he was approaching a wounded bird. "Because you've been avoiding me." She looked away, her jaw tight. "I've just been busy." "Don't lie to me," he said softly. "Please." She bit her lip, and for a long moment, the only sound between them was the rustle of wind through the trees. Then she whispered, "Why does it matter, Daniel? You're you. I'm just me." He took another step closer. Her shoulders tensed. "I don't want to be someone people talk about behind your back. The girl who chased a rich doctor hoping to get lucky." His eyes darkened, but not with anger, with something sadder, older, deeper. "Sophie," he said gently, "you might be the first person in my life who's ever run away from me because I have money." She blinked. "I'm not used to that," he added, his voice quieter now. "Most people run toward the lifestyle, not away from it." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. "But I didn't want you to think I was one of them," she said, her voice breaking. "Because I'm not. I never have been. I didn't know how to be enough." Daniel stared at her for a moment. Then, with a look that could melt ice, he whispered the words that cracked her wide open. "You were always enough. From the very first moment you walked into my office, terrified and brave all at once, you were already more than enough." And just like that, something inside her shattered and softened at the same time. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. So instead, she cried. And Daniel, he stepped forward, arms outstretched, no walls, no wealth, no ego. Just a man reaching for a woman he couldn't stop thinking about. And finally, she let him hold her. The evening had started like any other. The bookstore was quiet. The sky outside was fading into shades of ash and rose, the last glow of day melting into night. Sophie had stayed late, cleaning up a display, reorganizing a shelf that didn't really need reorganizing. Her head ached, her limbs were heavy, but she kept going, because sometimes it was easier to stay busy than to feel. She told herself she was fine, told herself it was just a long day, maybe not enough water, maybe not enough food. Maybe if she just got home and slept, everything would be okay. But as she stepped out onto the street, something shifted. The world tilted. The sidewalk rose up to meet her, and then blackness. The first thing she felt was warmth. A blanket. A pillow. The soft hum of something rhythmic in the background. The next thing was sound. Footsteps. Distant voices. A monitor beeping somewhere nearby. And then, him. When her eyes fluttered open, the first thing she saw was Daniel, sitting beside her bed. His elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed, fingers laced tightly together like he was holding something in. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes, usually sharp and confident, looked tired and scared. "Sophie," he breathed when he saw her stir, the relief in his voice washing over her like a wave. "You scared the hell out of me." She blinked slowly. Her throat was dry. What happened?" You collapsed outside the bookstore, he said, his voice tight. Ambulance brought you in. You had a fever, dehydrated, worn down. You've been pushing yourself too hard. He stood, adjusting the blanket around her gently, carefully, as though afraid she might break. I didn't mean to worry you, she whispered. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down again, closer this time. His eyes met hers. Not as a doctor, not as a man who had the world at his fingertips, but as someone who had stayed all night for someone he couldn't bear to lose. You're allowed to need help, Sophie. Her gaze dropped. I'm not used to it, she said softly. Needing people. His jaw clenched, something flickering in his eyes. Neither am I. Silence. She could feel the weight of the night settle around them. Not heavy, but real. Raw. And then almost in a whisper he added, I've been where you are, you know. Burned out. Pretending I was fine until I wasn't. She turned her head toward him, curious. I didn't always have money, he said. Didn't always have this life. I worked 3 jobs to pay my way through med school. Slept in my car some nights. Ate whatever I could afford. Sophie's eyes widened, the image hard to match with the polished man sitting in front of her. And when I finally made it, he continued, his voice quieter now, I thought I'd finally earned love. Real love. He swallowed hard, jaw tight. I met someone. She was beautiful, sharp, said all the right things, and I believed her. Sophie didn't speak. She didn't need to. She didn't love me, he said. She loved the title, the lifestyle, the attention. A long pause. I came home early one day and found out the truth. Sophie's heart ached for him, not for the betrayal, but for the loneliness that must have followed, the wall he'd built since. She taught me not to trust easily, Daniel said, to question people's intentions, to wonder if I'd ever be more than just a name on a building. He looked at her then, really looked. But you never once asked me about my money, Sophie. Not once. You never treated me like anything but a man trying to do his job. She blinked away the tears that stung her eyes. I guess I'm just scared, she whispered. Me too, he admitted. And that was the most honest thing either of them had said all night. So when he reached for her hand, gently, without pressure, without expectation, Sophie didn't pull away. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt alone. The hospital stay lasted only 3 days, but something shifted in those 72 hours. Not just in Sophie's body, but in her heart. Each time she opened her eyes, he was there, sitting beside her, quiet, present, never asking for anything, never demanding more than she could give. And that, perhaps more than anything else, undid her. Because Daniel didn't try to fix her. He simply stayed. On her last night in the hospital, she looked at him across the dim room, the glow of the hallway light catching the edges of his face. There were lines under his eyes. He hadn't shaved. He looked tired. But when he caught her looking at him, he smiled. Softly. Simply. Like she was something worth waiting for. And for the first time, she didn't look away. I used to think people like you weren't real, she said suddenly, her voice low. Daniel tilted his head. People like me? She nodded, curling her knees slightly under the blanket. Beautiful. Brilliant. Gentle. The kind of man women dream about but never meet. He chuckled, shaking his head. I think you're giving me too much credit. She smiled. And I think maybe I haven't given myself enough. He went quiet, but his eyes... Oh. His eyes said everything. They said finally. They said you see it now too, don't you? You see, in the weeks that followed, Sophie found herself growing. Not away from who she had been, but toward something softer. Braver. She still had days when doubt crept in. But Daniel never tried to silence her fears. Instead, he held space for them, for her. They met for coffee most mornings before work. They walked the quiet neighborhoods after dinner, hands brushing, hearts sinking. And slowly, Sophie let the walls fall. She told him about her father's death when she was 12, about how her mother had crumbled in silence, leaving Sophie to grow up too fast. She told him about the nights she cried in the back room of the bookstore because the world felt too heavy for someone like her. Daniel never interrupted, never pitied her. He just listened, like her words mattered. And one evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and painted the world gold, Daniel reached for her hand and said, "You are the bravest person I know." She didn't respond. She just leaned her head on his shoulder and smiled. It was a late spring evening when Daniel asked her to meet him at the cafe, the same one where they'd bumped into each other for the second time, the same one where everything between them began to feel real. Sophie walked in, expecting a table and 2 mugs. Instead, she found candles, a private corner bathed in soft golden light, and Daniel, standing beside the table, nervously adjusting his sleeves, something small and velvet in his palm. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice just barely above a whisper. She froze. He took a step closer. "I didn't plan this like I do everything else," he admitted. "No grand gesture, no perfect speech." She blinked, heart racing. "I just know," he said, eyes locked on hers, "that I don't want to spend another day wondering if I'll get to hold your hand in the morning, or hear your voice before I fall asleep." He sank to one knee. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I don't care where we come from. I don't care what people say. I only care about this. You and me. Quiet mornings, honest nights, and a love that doesn't ask either of us to be anything but who we are." He opened the box. "Sophie Bennett, will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision. She couldn't find the words, so she nodded, hard, fast, breathless, before falling to her knees beside him and wrapping her arms around his neck. And just like that, the world went quiet. 2 hearts, once broken and uncertain, now steady and whole, together. The Carter estate had never looked more alive. The gardens, once formal and still, now burst with color. Wildflowers spilling over manicured edges, lanterns swaying from the trees like stars brought down to earth. Guests filled the rows of white chairs, the air thick with anticipation and birdsong. But Sophie stood at the edge of it all, hidden behind a curtain of ivy, her heart hammering in her chest. Her gown was simple. Soft ivory silk that hugged her gently. No glitter, no fuss. Just her. A small bouquet of forget-me-nots and garden roses trembled slightly in her hand. Lisa, her best friend and maid of honor, leaned in with a smile. "You ready?" Sophie exhaled shakily. "I don't know." Lisa squeezed her hand. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present." And with that, the music began. As Sophie stepped into the sunlight, a hush fell. Every eye turned. But Daniel only saw her. He stood beneath the archway of white blooms, dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair kissed by the breeze. His eyes locked on hers, and in that moment, the rest of the world fell away. She walked slowly, every step a memory. Her first visit to his office. The fear, the silence, the tension, then the cafe, the hospital. The moment she collapsed into his arms and whispered, "Don't leave." Every broken piece of their past had led here, to this path, to this man, to this vow. When she reached him, he didn't say a word. He just took her hand, and his thumb pressed gently into her palm, a quiet reminder. "I'm here. I've always been here." Their vows weren't grand. There were no poems, no polished speeches, just 2 people standing face to face, offering everything they had, exactly as they were. "I was never good at believing I deserved love," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "But then you stood still when I ran. You saw through the noise. You waited. And somehow, that healed things in me I didn't even know were broken." Daniel blinked back tears. Sophie, he said softly. I spent years trying to build a life people would admire, but none of it mattered until I found someone who didn't care about any of it. Someone who looked at me like I was just a man. Just Daniel. And that saved me. When the officiant finally said, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Sophie didn't wait. She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, her hands trembling on his chest as the crowd erupted in cheers. And just like that, they were home. Later that night, as the reception faded and stars lit the sky above their quiet garden, Daniel and Sophie stood alone beneath a tree hung with fairy lights. No music, no noise, just them. She rested her head on his shoulder. He held her waist with both arms, like he still couldn't believe she was real. I used to think love had to be loud, she whispered. Big, dazzling. He kissed her temple. Turns out it's the quiet parts that last the longest. She smiled against him. Thank you for waiting. He pulled back, his eyes soft, full of a promise that needed no words. I'd wait a lifetime.